Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
My wife and I had been living in Hong Kong for a few years by the time COVID hit. We both worked decent jobs, lived below our means, and saved consistently. We had originally planned to fly home to South Africa for Easter. Tickets were booked, bags were mentally packed, and we were genuinely looking forward to it. Then lockdowns started spreading across the globe, and that trip got cancelled fast. We were disappointed, sure, but we were safe and stable. That's more than a lot of people in our expat community could say. I was part of an online group for South African expats living across Asia. When travel restrictions started tightening, the panic in that group was real. A lot of people had just recently relocated to China for work, which meant they hadn't had time to build up savings yet. Now they were stranded, watching their window to get home shrink by the day with not enough money to buy a ticket out. My wife and I looked at what we had set aside for our own trip and made a decision pretty quickly. We were going to use it to help people get home instead. Over the following weeks, we helped 10 people get back to South Africa. We didn't ask for anything in return. We just booked the tickets and wished them safe travels. The process was the same each time. Someone would reach out through the group, explain their situation, and I would find the best available option within our budget and book it directly so no money had to change hands. Most of them paid us back eventually in their own time, and we genuinely didn't hold it against the ones who didn't. That was never the point. Then there was Karen. Karen was stuck in Beijing and reached out through the group. She explained that she had no money and needed a ticket home before lockdown made it impossible. I messaged her directly, told her I was willing to help, and made it clear that I had a set budget I was working within. She thanked me and said she was relieved. That relief lasted about 5 minutes. Almost immediately after agreeing to accept my help, Karen came back with a very specific list of demands. She wanted a direct flight from Beijing all the way to Johannesburg, and then a separate connecting flight from Johannesburg down to East London. No flexibility, no alternatives. That was what she wanted. I looked up the prices. Both legs were expensive on their own, and with demand spiking as lockdown deadlines got closer, they were even worse. The total blew well past my budget, so I went back to her with a different option. I told her I could book her an indirect route instead, something routed through Dubai or Ethiopia, which would add a third leg to the journey but would get her home comfortably within what I had available. She shot it down without much thought. She made it pretty clear that if I couldn't book her something as direct as possible, she wasn't interested in my help at all. She even suggested that if I was serious about helping, I should just stretch the budget to cover what she actually wanted. I didn't argue. I just stopped responding and shifted my attention to someone else who had reached out around the same time. That person was in a similar situation, stuck, broke, and running out of time, but their first message was just a simple thank you for even considering helping them. I booked their flights within the day. They sent a voice note after landing that my wife and I still talk about. About a week went by with no word from Karen. The lockdown deadline was creeping closer, and her options were disappearing fast. Then she came back, and the tone had changed completely. She dropped all the demands and told me she would take anything I could find. She was clearly panicking and just needed to get out. I told my wife about it, and we agreed without much debate that we would still help. We weren't the type to leave someone stranded just to feel righteous about it. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't approach the search for her flights with a very specific kind of enthusiasm. I found a routing that technically covered everything she needed. It left Beijing, made 3 stops along the way, and landed in Johannesburg. Total travel time came in at just under 40 hours. Not comfortable, not quick, but every leg was real and every connection was doable. I let her know I had found something within budget that would get her to Johannesburg and that I would send the full details once the booking was confirmed. She accepted without pushback this time. Then came the finishing touch. Karen had originally insisted on a regional flight from Johannesburg down to East London. I checked the prices on that. Still expensive, But I found something else that covered the same distance for a fraction of the cost. A 20-hour bus. I looked at it for a moment, checked that it was a legitimate service with confirmed departures, and booked it without hesitation. I sent her the complete itinerary without much commentary. Nearly 40 hours of flight spread across 3 connections, followed by a 20-hour bus ride to her final destination. Door to destination, she was looking at roughly 60 hours of total travel. She confirmed she received it and didn't say much else at first. Then the messages started coming in as she made her way through each leg of the journey. Every stop seemed to bring a new complaint. The first layover was too long. The second connection was in an airport she found unpleasant. By the time she landed in Johannesburg and saw that the final leg was a bus, the messages stopped being complaints and turned into something closer to disbelief. She was furious. She couldn't believe I had booked her onto a bus and wanted to know how I could do something like that to someone I was supposed to be helping. She said it was humiliating, especially after 2 days of travel. I told her plainly that it got her to East London and that it was within budget. She came back and accused me of doing it on purpose. I didn't respond to that one. She had everything she needed to get home safely. The rest was just uncomfortable, which felt about right given how the whole thing had started. She sent a few more messages over the following days, mostly variations of how miserable the bus was and how she couldn't believe a stranger who had volunteered to help her had put her through that. I read all of them. I didn't reply to most of them. She never paid me back, which I had fully expected. Not a cent, not an acknowledgement, not even a message once the dust settled saying she had made it home safely. The only updates I got were complaints right up until she presumably walked off that bus in East London. What I hadn't expected was how satisfying the whole thing would feel, not in a cruel way exactly, but in the quiet way that happens when something lands exactly as it should without you having to force it. Karen got home. She was safe. She was just considerably more tired and a good deal more humbled than she had planned on being. 9 other people got home too, and most of them still check in every now and then with a kind word or a message of gratitude that still feels genuine years later. One of them even sent us a gift when things settled down, completely unprompted. The difference between those 9 people and Karen wasn't money or circumstance. It was just the way they treated someone who was trying to help them. I started playing soccer when I was 7 years old. It began with a little recreational league my dad signed me up for, and by the time I hit middle school, I had made the competitive travel team. That meant practice every weekday after school and games on weekends. It was exhausting, but I loved it. The downside was that I was always sweaty and dirty by the time I got home. My mom made it the rule early on that I had to shower right after practice. No exceptions. I got it. I was gross after running around for 2 hours in the heat. So I built a routine and I stuck to it. Shower in the morning before school, shower again after practice. Every single day. For a while, things were fine. Then, somewhere around 5th grade, my mom started making comments. She'd tell me I needed to go shower, and when I told her I had just gotten out, she'd say it didn't smell like it. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was in a bad mood. Maybe she smelled something else. I didn't think much of it. But then it kept happening. Over and over. She'd say it right after I showered. She'd say it when I came downstairs in the morning, fresh out of the bathroom with wet hair. She'd say it randomly in the middle of the day. And the way she'd do it was the part that got to me. She'd actually bend down toward me and sniff, like she was inspecting a piece of old food she found at the back of the fridge. She'd call me over, ask if I could smell that, and then demand to know when I last showered. When I told her it had been that morning, barely an hour ago, she'd act like that wasn't good enough and tell me to go take another one. I started to spiral. I was in 5th grade. I didn't need more reasons to feel weird about myself. I remember pulling my friends aside at school and asking them straight up if I smelled bad. Every single one of them said no. One of my closest friends even told me she'd definitely say something if there was a problem because that's what friends do. Nobody ever said I had a problem. Not a teacher, not a coach, not anyone. But my mom just wouldn't stop. And when you hear something often enough, You start to believe it even when all the evidence says otherwise. I started carrying deodorant in my backpack. I started avoiding standing close to people. I sprayed perfume before leaving the house every morning just to feel safe. I was doing everything short of bathing in a tub full of soap, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she was right. Maybe there was something wrong with me that nobody else was willing to tell me about. By the time high school came around, the comments were just part of daily life. I'd walk in the door after practice, and before I could even put down my bag, she'd tell me to go shower and that I stank. I'd tell her I was literally about to, and she'd snap back that I should have already done it. I'd shower, come back downstairs, and sometimes she'd hit me with it again, asking if I had actually showered because it didn't smell like I had. When I pointed out that I had just gotten out and that my hair was still wet, she'd brush it off and say she was just saying, like that was supposed to make it better. It was like nothing I did was ever going to be enough, and I couldn't even argue my way out of it because how do you prove you don't smell bad? I couldn't hand her a certificate, I couldn't call a witness. I just had to stand there and take it while she sniffed around me like some kind of weird smell detective. Then one evening after practice, I came home, showered, changed into clean clothes, and came downstairs to eat dinner. I barely sat down when she leaned over and did the thing again, that slow, deliberate sniff. Then she asked if I had actually showered, said it didn't really smell like it, and told me I should go take another one. Something just broke inside me. I don't know if it was years of built-up frustration or just the fact that I was exhausted from practice and hungry and I didn't have the energy to keep absorbing it anymore. I pushed back from the table and told her to stop. I told her she said this every single day and that it wasn't true. I told her I showered twice a day, that I wore deodorant, that I wore perfume, and that nobody else thought I smelled bad. I told her she was the only person on the planet who kept saying this and that she had been saying it for years, and it made me feel absolutely terrible about myself. I told her to please just stop. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with that expression parents get when they think you've embarrassed them even though nobody else is in the room. Later that night, my dad pulled me aside and told me I hadn't needed to yell like that and that I had overreacted and should have just ignored it. I told him I had been ignoring it for years and that it hadn't stopped. He said she was just trying to help. I told him there was nothing to help with, that every single one of my friends said I smelled fine, that my coaches had never said anything, that she was the only one, and that she had been doing it since elementary school and I was tired of it. He didn't really have an answer for that, and he just gave me the whole she means well speech and walked away, and I think that made me angrier than anything else, because I wasn't looking for an apology from him. I just wanted someone in my own house to say, yeah, okay, that's not okay. Instead, I got told I overreacted. My mom didn't bring it up again that night. The next morning, she acted like nothing happened, which is pretty standard. But here's the thing. She hasn't made a single comment since. Not one. It's been almost 2 weeks and the sniffing and the remarks have just stopped completely. I don't know if she finally realized how bad it had been or if the fact that I actually said something out loud made her think twice. Either way, I'm not spending any more time analyzing it. I said what I needed to say, and it worked. I'm a line cook at a diner about 3 blocks from the East Side station. My shift usually starts at 6 in the morning, which means I'm catching the subway at 5:45 when the platforms are still half empty and the city hasn't fully woken up yet. Most mornings it's just me, a few other early risers, some construction workers, the occasional overnight nurse heading home. Quiet, uneventful, just how I like it. That morning started no differently. I swiped my card, headed down the stairs, and took my usual spot near the middle of the platform. There were maybe 15 or 20 people scattered around waiting. The board showed the next train was about 4 minutes out. That's when I noticed a young woman standing near the edge of the platform. She looked to be in her early 20s. She had a tote bag over her shoulder and she was looking down at her phone, earbuds in, just standing there minding her business. Nothing unusual about that. Half the platform was doing the same thing. Then Karen showed up. I call her Karen because there's no other word for what she was. A middle-aged woman in a blazer rolling a small suitcase behind her, walking like she owned every inch of ground she stepped on. She came down the stairs fast and clearly in a rush. She started weaving through the people on the platform, and then she got to the young woman near the edge. Karen told her to move, said she needed to get through. The young woman didn't react. She was still looking at her phone. Karen said it again, louder this time, telling her to move out of the way. Still nothing. Karen's voice went up another level. She was practically yelling at this point, demanding the young woman get out of her way. A few of us looked over. She stepped closer and screamed at her, throwing in a nasty little jab, asking her if she was deaf. There was a pause. And then, as if the universe had the worst sense of timing, I realized that the answer to that question was yes. Because the young woman finally looked up, not because she heard Karen, but probably because she felt the vibration of Karen slamming her suitcase handle down. And when she looked up, I could see the hearing aids. Small ones, but they were there if you were paying any attention at all. The young woman looked at Karen with a calm, slightly confused expression. She pointed to her ear and shook her head slowly, the universal gesture that said she couldn't hear her. She even pulled out a small notepad from her tote bag and quickly scribbled something on it, holding it up toward Karen. It said she was deaf and asked Karen what she needed. She was trying to help. She was actually trying to help the woman who had been screaming at her. Most people would have felt embarrassed and just walked around. Most people would have taken a breath and moved on. Karen was not most people. Karen knocked the notepad out of her hand. She accused the young woman of playing games with her and told her to just move. She grabbed the young woman's arm. The young woman pulled back and stumbled slightly, trying to steady herself. That's when it happened. Karen, in what I can only describe as a complete and total loss of her mind, shoved her, hard, both hands, right toward the edge. The young woman went over. I heard the thud when she hit the tracks. The platform went dead silent for about half a second, and then it erupted. Someone screamed. Someone else started yelling for people to call for help. I was already moving toward the edge to look down, and she was lying there on the tracks, completely still. She had hit her head on the way down and passed out cold. Two guys jumped down without a second of hesitation. They were trying to lift her, calling up to people on the platform to help pull her up. I looked at the board. 2 minutes on the clock, maybe less. A woman near me was already on the phone with emergency services, talking fast, giving the station name and telling them someone had fallen onto the tracks and wasn't moving. Another guy ran toward the emergency intercom on the wall and hit the button, telling the transit operator exactly what happened so they could halt any incoming trains. I turned around to find Karen, and she was already backing toward the stairs, pulling her suitcase, looking like she was about to make a run for it. She had her head down and was moving fast. She didn't make it far. A man near the stairs cut her off and tackled her to the ground, suitcase and all. He sat on her and told her she wasn't going anywhere. She started screaming about her rights and demanding people let her go. The man holding her down shot back that everyone on the platform had seen her push that girl and told her to stay down. A couple of other people closed in around them, making sure she had nowhere to go even if she managed to wiggle free. Back at the edge, people were pulling the young woman up. She was limp but breathing. Someone had their jacket under her head the moment she was back on the platform. Someone pressed a folded shirt against the back of her head where she had hit it, trying to slow the bleeding. The train rolled in about 40 seconds later, and the conductor hit the brakes the moment he saw the commotion. By then, she was already off the tracks and safe. And then came the moment that honestly made the whole nightmare almost worth witnessing. An older woman, easily in her 70s, had been standing near the stairs the entire time. Small woman, white hair, sensible shoes, the kind of grandma you'd see knitting in a park. She had watched the whole thing. She watched Karen try to run. She watched Karen get tackled. She walked over, looked down at Karen on the ground, still screaming about being let go, and then she slapped her. Once, clean across the face. The sound cracked through the whole platform. Then she looked down at Karen and told her she ought to be ashamed of herself. Just those words, flat and even, like she was stating a simple fact. Karen went completely silent. The police arrived about 3 minutes later. By the time they came down the stairs, about a dozen people were already standing around Karen with their phones out, telling the officers they had the whole thing on video. Karen tried to tell her side of the story the moment she saw the badges. One of the officers cut her off and told her to save it. They cuffed her right there on the platform, walked her up the stairs, and that was the last I saw of her. The paramedics came for the young woman shortly after. She was still unconscious when they loaded her onto the stretcher, but one of the medics told the people standing around that her pulse was steady and they expected her to be okay. Before the paramedics wheeled her away, I noticed the notepad she had been writing on earlier was still on the ground near the edge. Someone picked it up and handed it to one of the medics to go with her. It felt like the right thing to do. I gave my statement to the police, told them exactly what I saw, and eventually made it to work almost 2 hours late. My manager took one look at my face and didn't say a word about it. I never found out what happened to either of them after that. A few years back, I was working for a small solar company, and it was one of the better jobs I'd had. The team was tight, the work was straightforward, and management actually understood what we did day to day. We had maybe 2 or 3 short meetings a week, always scheduled around the field work, never against it. Nobody was breathing down your neck about being on a call when you were 45 minutes out on a job site. My role was mostly field work. Around 80% of my time was spent driving out to locations, doing assessments, handling installations, coordinating with clients on site. The other 20% was office stuff, paperwork, follow-ups, that kind of thing. Some of the locations on my list were over an hour away, and on a normal day I'd need to hit 5 or 6 of them. It was a lot of ground to cover, but we were good at it. Our office consistently ranked among the top in the whole company for both the number and quality of installations. We knew our region, we knew our workflow, and we kept our numbers up without anyone having to micromanage us. Then the acquisition happened. A massive solar corporation, the kind that had swallowed up half the smaller players in the industry, bought us out. At first, it didn't feel like much changed. Same office, same team, same work. But then the corporate structure started bleeding in, and within a few weeks, our meeting schedule looked nothing like what it used to be. 2 or 3 short meetings a week turned into roughly 10 meetings a week, each one running anywhere from 45 minutes to a full hour. Daily check-ins, weekly department calls, regional calls that seemed to exist for no other reason than to remind us that a big company now owned us. It was relentless. For a while, I tried to manage it the way I'd always managed my day. If a call landed while I was in the field, I'd either skip it or dial in, keep it on in the background, and get on with whatever I needed to do. I wasn't ignoring them entirely, I was just treating them like background noise while I actually did my job. That worked until it didn't. My regional manager called me in one day and made it very clear that half listening wasn't going to cut it anymore. She told me I needed to be actively participating in every call, not just on the line but actually engaged. I pushed back and explained that most of these calls were landing right in the middle of drives or while I was already at a location. She didn't budge. She told me to pull over, park the car, and take the call from there. When I asked what was supposed to happen with the locations I couldn't get to because I was sitting in a parking lot, she told me to just reschedule them. That was her answer. Reschedule them. As if the clients, the timelines, and the metrics would just patiently wait while we burned an hour parked outside a gas station listening to a regional director talk about synergy. She made it clear that if I wasn't fully present and participating, it would become a write-up. So that's exactly what we did. Every single one of us. A call at 10 in the morning while I was 20 minutes from a job site meant I'd pull into the nearest parking lot, park the car, and sit there for an hour. If the call ran long, I'd sit there longer. Once the call was over, if I didn't have enough time left in the day to make it to the location and get everything done without going into overtime, I'd drive back to the office and reschedule. The company had a strict no overtime without approval policy, so there was no working late to make up the difference. When the clock hit the end of the shift, we stopped. Within a few weeks, our productivity had dropped by around 60%. Installations that used to get done weren't getting done. Clients were waiting longer. The numbers that had made our office one of the best in the company were quietly falling apart. It didn't take long before our regional manager was standing in our office with a look on her face like she just found out the building was on fire. She wanted to know what was going on and why our numbers had tanked so badly. Nobody said anything at first. Then one of my co-workers broke it down for her plainly. He explained that we were covering a massive region, that most of us were doing field work the majority of the day, and that we were now spending roughly 10 hours a week parked in lots taking calls that had nothing to do with what we actually did. He reminded her that we had been told to participate fully or face a write-up, so that's what we were doing. She asked what was going on and whether we were doing it on purpose. I stepped in and told her we were doing exactly what we had been told. Park the car, take the call, participate. If a location got missed because of a call, reschedule it. No overtime without approval. I pointed out that those were the rules we had been given and we were following them to the letter. She tried to say that wasn't what she had meant, but I reminded her that it was exactly what she had said. She didn't have a quick answer for that. After some back and forth, she took it up the chain, and they did eventually cut the meetings back down. Not all the way, but enough that we could breathe again and actually get back to work. For a little while, it felt like things might settle. Then the full takeover happened. The big company stopped treating us like a functioning office and started treating us like a department to be standardized. The meeting creep came back. New reporting requirements, new approval chains, processes that made no sense for field-heavy work being pushed down from people who had clearly never spent a day doing what we did. One by one, people started leaving. I was one of them. So were most of the people who had built that office into what it was. Some found other companies, some left the industry entirely. Within a few months, the team that had held the second best metrics in the entire corporation was essentially gone. The company tried to keep the office running. They brought in new people, tried to rebuild. But what we had wasn't something you could just replace by filling seats. The knowledge of the region, the relationships with clients, the efficiency we had built up over years, none of that transferred. The installation quality dropped. The numbers didn't come back. Eventually, corporate made the call that everyone who'd been paying attention already knew was coming. They closed the office. The same office that had ranked second in the whole company. Shut down because they couldn't figure out that the people doing the work needed time to actually do it. I had just spent 2 weeks on a vacation island, the kind of trip I had been planning for almost a year. My job in logistics basically means my life runs on schedules, deadlines, and things going wrong at the worst possible times. I had taken the time off to decompress, to get away from all of that. No emails, no phone calls, just sun and water and doing absolutely nothing that required a spreadsheet. By the time I was boarding that flight home, I was genuinely relaxed for the first time in what felt like years. 4 hours in the air, and I would be back on the ground by 4 p.m. My plan was simple. Land, grab my bag, take a cab home, and sleep in my own bed. Clean, easy, no drama. I should have known the universe had other plans. The flight started normally. I had a window seat which I had paid a little extra for. The woman next to me, Karen, settled in without a word. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, dressed like she was heading to a business meeting, and spent the first half of the flight scrolling through her phone with the energy of someone deeply important who was being deeply inconvenienced by the act of existing near other people. About 2 hours in, the pilot came over the intercom and asked if there was a doctor on board. Anyone who has ever flown knows that sentence immediately changes the atmosphere of the entire cabin. People stopped talking. A few heads turned. 2 men a few rows ahead of me stood up and made their way toward the back of the plane without hesitation. I watched them disappear behind the curtain and felt that quiet unease that spreads through a cabin when everyone is thinking the same thing, but nobody is saying it out loud. About 10 minutes passed. Then the pilot came back on and told us that we had a medical emergency on board and that we would be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport for the safety of the passenger. He apologized for the inconvenience and asked for our patience. The cabin went quiet for a second, then people started murmuring. A flight attendant walked quickly down the aisle carrying what looked like a medical kit, her face giving nothing away. I looked out the window and watched the plane begin to descend. When we landed, there was already an ambulance waiting on the tarmac, along with what looked like a medical team. They moved fast and professionally. A few minutes later, I watched through my window as they carried an elderly man off the plane on a stretcher. He looked pale and completely still. A woman followed close behind him, crying, clutching her bag, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. One of the flight attendants walked beside her with a hand on her shoulder, guiding her off the plane. The whole cabin watched in silence. The pilot came back on once they were off the plane and told us that the passenger had been experiencing a cardiac event and was now in the care of the emergency team. He let us know that the plane would be refueling and that the luggage would be sorted and that we should expect to arrive at our destination at around 6 p.m. instead of 4 p.m. He thanked us again for our patience. 6 p.m. instead of 4 p.m., 2 hours later than planned. Not ideal, but a man had just been taken off the plane in the middle of a heart attack. I think most reasonable people understood the math there. Most reasonable people. For a minute or two after the announcement, the cabin was unusually calm. People were looking at each other with that shared understanding that comes after watching something serious unfold right in front of you. A man a few rows up shook his head slowly and went back to his book. A young woman across the aisle put her headphones back on and looked out the window. Then Karen opened her mouth. She started complaining out loud, saying she was going to be 2 hours late and that her son was waiting for her at the airport. She made sure everyone around her knew exactly how inconvenient this was for her personally. At first, I thought she was talking to someone specific. I looked around. No, she was just talking to the air, to anyone who would listen. Then she said that elderly people simply should not fly, that if someone could not handle a flight, they should just stay home. She called the whole situation an impudence and said it was not fair to the rest of the passengers who had places to be. A few people around her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The man across the aisle glanced over at her, then looked away without saying anything. Nobody engaged with her. I turned and looked at her. She was not done. She went on about how her son had been waiting at the airport and how she was stuck on the plane because someone could not manage their own health. At some point, she turned to the passenger in the row behind us and tried to pull them into the conversation, complaining loudly enough that there was no way to ignore her. The person behind us gave a short, uncomfortable nod and said nothing back. That was the one that did it for me. I had managed to stay quiet through the first 15 minutes of it. I told myself it was not my problem, that she would wind down, that it was not worth the energy. But there is a limit to how long you can sit 18 inches away from someone saying something like that before something in you just refuses to let it go. I turned to her and told her to stop. She looked at me like I had just appeared out of nowhere. I told her that a man had just had a heart attack, that he had been carried off the plane on a stretcher, and that his wife had walked off behind him in tears. I told her that nobody on the flight had wanted to be delayed, but that the man certainly had not planned to have a cardiac emergency in the middle of the air either. I pointed out that her son could wait 2 hours and that somewhere in a hospital, that man's family was sitting and waiting to find out if he was going to be okay. She opened her mouth to say something. I kept going. I told her that the way she was talking about him, like he had done this on purpose, like he was just some inconvenience who should have stayed home, was one of the most selfish things I had heard in a long time. I told her that everyone on the plane was in the exact same situation and that she was the only one making noise about it. I will be honest, I said a few things after that which were not exactly polite. I was 2 weeks relaxed and she had burned through most of it in 15 minutes. My filter was not fully operational. But I said what I said. A couple of people nearby had been watching the whole exchange. One woman a row ahead of me turned around after I finished and gave me a small nod before turning back around. Nobody came to Karen's defense. Karen stared at me for a long moment. Her mouth was a flat, tight line. She looked away, looked back, and then gave me the most poisonous look I have ever received from a stranger. And then she said absolutely nothing for the rest of the flight. Not a single word. Every 20 minutes or so, she would turn her head slowly and give me the kind of glare that was probably meant to make me feel bad about myself. It did not work. I just looked back at her until she turned away again. When the plane finally took off again, the mood in the cabin had shifted back to something closer to normal. People were watching movies, reading, or dozing off. The flight attendants came around with drinks, and the whole thing settled into an ordinary flight. Karen put her headphones on and stared straight ahead for the remaining 2 hours. We landed at 6 p.m. just like the pilot said. When the seatbelt sign went off and people started standing up to grab their bags, Karen was one of the first on her feet. She pulled her bag from the overhead compartment, pushed past the people in the aisle without a word, and was gone. I took my time. I grabbed my bag, thanked the flight attendant on the way out, and walked through the terminal at my own pace. I took a cab home, ate leftovers, and went to bed early. I hope the elderly man made it through. I really do. And I hope his wife, wherever she ended up that night in a country that was not her own, had someone looking after her. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.